Good afternoon to everyone. Good afternoon, Ben. My name is David Levy-Faour, and we are taking part in a series of seminars on governance, on theories of governance. And today we have the honor to host Benjamin Cashore. Benjamin let me put it this way, is the Lee Ka-shing Professor in Public Management and Director of the Institute of Environment and Sustainability in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Policy at the National University, Singapore. He's specializing on multi-level environmental governance, on global governance, comparative public policy administration. It goes on, and I will not take too much time and give the floor to Ben, because what he has to say usually, and I know for sure also for today, is very, very interesting. Thank you very much for being here with us in Jerusalem, Ben, and we are looking forward to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and it's really a pleasure and honor to be here in Jerusalem and speaking to both Hebrew University and the broader intellectual community. And so I'm going to now start my presentation. And I do want to warn you, I'm going to be a little bit reflexive and a little bit provocative, but in order to generate, I'm hoping, some conversations that cut across our various disciplines and our various ways of thinking about, in my case, the challenges of sustainability facing our world, especially the climate crisis. So I'm going to now, I've shared my screen, and it says pause, but can you now see it okay?
Yeah? Yes, I see. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So as you can tell, the title alone is provocative, right? Four phases: sustainability, governance, and sailing our planet, and what to do about it. This is actually the title of a book that I'm working on that's integrating a number of different sort of parts of my collaborative efforts over the last 25 years, speaking about both public policy, private governance, and sustainability. So with that, I'm going to just get right to it and leave some time for questions and answers at the end. But what I want to do is begin with noting that for really over 3 decades, problem-oriented social scientists have devoted really considerable attention to sustainability governance in some way or the other. But I'm going to argue in this talk, that I've been arguing in other papers and other talks that I've been developing over time, that many of us, including myself, have misdiagnosed the institution building project at hand. Okay? I'm going to argue that it's not one of collective action, the Eller Austin kind of approach we're aware of, or in general, the very metaphor of collective action guides our cognitive frame. So that, I'm going to argue, is not the correct metaphor of the problems we're facing. Nor is it one of intergovernmental cooperation, be it of a neo-realist or even neoliberal or kind of Cohen kind of idea about absolute and relative gains. And nor is it around even multi-stakeholder consensus, the stuff that political science allows on legitimacy and trust and so on. These are the wrong institutional building metaphors for the crises we're facing. Instead, I'm going to argue that if we want to manage climate, mass species extinctions, and even equity transformations, we need to reframe them as thermostatic building projects. This is my argument. These are thermostatic institutional challenges, not the ones that we've talked about before. I'm going to argue this in the talk. I'm also going to argue that the proliferation of market-driven policy tools, which is a common way now to think about sustainability globally, alongside the acceleration of planetary environmental crises, so there's a correlation between market-based mechanisms and ongoing degradation, is not owing to poor policy design and implementation challenges. That's much of the crowd of sustainability governance argues is the problem, how to design better. I'm going to argue instead it's owing to highly successful but competing sustainability transformation projects. And that means we must disentangle the transformations we're talking about, which therefore will affect the solutions or approaches we're taking. This all means together, these two arguments, that explanatory and applied policy analysis has to explicitly identify the problems we seek to understand and improve if we're going to move forward. Okay, so two very provocative arguments that are related but distinct that I want to, I'm going to make in my remaining of my talk. And I'm going to argue we must never extrapolate lessons from very different problems. I would never conflate them because the lessons from one transformation project do not travel to the others. They just do not travel. If you try and do that, you undermine that particular project. Okay, provocative but also abstract. The remainder of my talk, I'm going to actually elaborate this argument. Okay, I'm going to detail why I'm making this point and why I think it matters empirically, theoretically, conceptually, and in terms of the policy innovations we seek to unleash in some way on the problems we face. So I'm going to review a lot now to unpack these two arguments, and I'm happy to answer questions and share more papers, but I'm going to go a broad sweep, in part because I argue by doing too narrow talks, we miss these linkages. So we have to be broad to understand these patterns that emerge. By not being broad, we've missed these patterns, I would argue. So I'm now going to ask you to fasten your seatbelts. We're going to go quite on a roller coaster ride.
Ben?
Yeah?
We hear you well, but not excellent. So maybe you should put your headphones. Am I right? What the others are saying?
I agree.
Okay.
Excellent. So
is it the connection or the headphones? I can do either.
Okay. We will cut it from the video later on. So take your time, and I'm going to look for the belt because I don't have fasten.
Okay, is that better? Is that better?
Yes, absolutely. Go on.
I'm not hearing you on my headphones, but if I sound better, I'll keep talking this way. I can also switch to a hotspot if that's going to be better for the connection.
I think the connection is fine. It's just about the audio. Yeah.
Okay. So here are just some acknowledgements. My thinking is part of a bunch of collaborative processes, so I acknowledge that. But here's our metaphor of the roller coaster that we're going to be on for the next 30 minutes or so. So I'm going to begin with the analytical framework for this roller coaster ride, and that's this phenomenon known as the whack-a-mole effect. Which can you guys see that video?
Yes,
not
now, but we saw you had to run it. Share it with volume, probably.
Okay. Can you see that? Can you see that now? The video?
Yes, but you should increase it.
You see the same?
Yes.
Yeah.
No voice, no audio.
Okay, so that is our analytical hook for today, called the whack-a-mole effect. And as you can see, it's this child arcade game in North America where you whack a mole in one hole, and then the mole appears in another hole, and you whack that mole, and the mole appears somewhere else. So you solve one problem, and you create another problem. And I could argue the whack-a-mole effect is the perfect metaphor for these transformation projects. You solve one problem, you alleviate poverty, and you render species extinct. You're always getting moles. So how do you decide what moles to whack, to me, is a really important question facing sustainability studies that we haven't really been thinking about carefully when extrapolating our design lessons and our research projects. So, there we go. So here's the video. Here's another graphic for you. Moles, whacking moles is what we're going to be thinking about today on our roller coaster journey. So I'm going to begin these mole whacking analysis by through looking at two empirical puzzles that I think help us ponder moles. the first puzzle is that some problems are getting better, but some are actually getting worse, despite long-standing policy attention. So some moles are being whacked, but other moles are actually appearing. So if we reflect for a second on 30 years of sustainability governance, we can go back to the Rio Earth Summit, and we can look at massive documents of sustainability goals. There was Agenda 21. We can go with 97 Kyoto's binding, which they Annex 1 countries agreed to go 5% below 1990 levels, which never happened. We had the 2008, we had the eight MDGs in 2000. We had the Bali COP agreement in 2007 on agreeing to finance the carbon and markets in the topic. We had Rio +20 green economy. Then we had the Paris Accord non-binding commitments, but stronger objectives around 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the story goes on to now having 17 better designed SDGs than the MDGs. And last year we had Glasgow COP26 on financing for carbon and forests, reinforcing these themes again and again. And if you look back the last 30 years, there's no question that finance and market-driven interventions have dominated the policy design space, from green climate funds to green bonds to eco-labeling programs that I work on, UN Global Compact, firm-level interventions and public-private partnerships, all on leveraging finance, leveraging markets to achieve some kind of sustainability outcome. So there's been this belief that these tools can whack environmental mold. In fact, at the Bali climate COP, the World Bank and many others really did believe that they'd finally solved the deforestation crisis by launching the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility as part of this effort called Reduced Emissions and Deforestation and Degradation, where the world leveraged finance to pay countries to stop deforesting these areas, linking therefore climate and diversity and win-win outcomes. And they even called this Bali agreement a watershed in addressing deforestation and climate. World Bank president said that FCTF is a groundbreaking financial mechanism that will reduce deforestation and forest degradation. Again, using the word watershed. So they believe they whacked the environmental mole with an innovative finance mechanism. And after this time, there's no question that there has been progress made on some problems. For example, SDG 8, economic growth, SDG 1, poverty alleviation, have gone in positive directions since the Bali COP, right? So we're seeing some things improving when it comes to those SDGs. And yet, we've seen the acceleration of other problems. Climate, SDG 13, the species extinctions under SDG 15 have not gone the direction that was expected. There's the Bali COP for global warming, as you all know. It continues to go upward, and despite rhetorical reports from IPCC talking about we have to act, these moles still appear. Tropical forest deforestation did not stop post Bali; it continues. The World Bank was wrong, and that mole was not whacked. Likewise, species extinctions continue. That mole is still there. So some problems are getting better, but some problems are not, despite the rhetorical flourishes about what these policy interventions can actually do. And as you know the story, right? More talking, more innovation, more talking, problems accelerating, more moles. So I think we have to handle and directly think about what we call the implementation depression cycle of global policy design and intervention, where there's the belief or the implementation depression cycle, the policy creation euphoria, implementation depression cycle of these interventions. The belief that finance and market-driven policy tools since Rio can yield synergies across sustainability goals. The moles that emerge are treated as a result of a poor design process. So MDGs weren't good enough, let's do SDGs. And when evidence comes along of accelerating problems, this leads to new and/or redesigned finance and market-driven tools to address these moles. And this leads to problems becoming worse. You get this constant cycle that actually is like Charlie Brown and Lucy over the football. It keeps on happening despite a belief that this time things will be different. The moles get bigger and bigger as we repeat this cycle, this devastating cycle where we're not learning the right lessons. So I want to argue this cycle continues in Glasgow, or could be continuing. Mark Carney sounded just like the World Bank did in 2007. Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy on Climate and Finance, who's rhetorically really concerned and morally concerned about the climate crisis, assessed COP's 130 trillion commitment of private capital towards net zero goals as a finally getting the design right. But up until today, there wasn't enough money in place, even though that's what they said in 2007. And he even said it's a watershed. So this word watershed keeps on happening despite no watershed actually happening when time goes on. So what do we then think about this? Why is this happening? I want to argue that sustainability scholars and practitioners tend to view the ineffectiveness of previous efforts as an implementation challenge when they looked at the success of SDGs 1 and 8 for lessons to ameliorate 13 and 15, when it is actually a whack-a-mole challenge. The success in SDGs 1 and 8 caused 13 and 15 moles. They caused them. We can't get out of this dilemma. But solving some problems creates others. We must better understand what's going on there if we are to design for the moles we seek to actually whack. So in all these cases in this slide, I just use this to say whether you're doing land conversion in Tasmania, whether you're doing palm oil crops in Borneo, whether you destroy mountains to get coal in the Appalachians, or you log in the Canadian boreal forest, you are going to create moles. There are no synergies. And that's just an empirical reality we have to get our heads around when it comes to things like species extinction and habitat loss. And no amount of financing mechanisms can change that reality. So if this is true, and I think in the book elaborates more why it does need to be true empirically, how do we then extricate ourselves from this policy creation euphoria, implementation, discussion, global environmental sustainability governance? I argue the first task is to really think about then that there are 4 different problems out there vying for attention. 4 different transformation projects behind the cognitive frame of sustainability scholars, and therefore the evidence they look at when they're seeking to interrogate and design accordingly. If we distinguish these 4 different transformation projects, we kind of think overcome this dilemma. So I therefore want to spend a little bit of time on this 2x2 table because it's at the heart of what I want to argue about thermostat. So this 2x2 table divides sustainability governance and scholarship into 2 questions, our age-old 2x2 table. One question is, does the practitioner or applied scholar generally identify and think about some kind of economic utility in some way as what's the motivating force for acting? Does utility in some way dominate analytical frames and applied policy law? And second, does the analytical frame, is it justified on the basis of particular features of the problem at hand, or is it meant to apply to any kind of problem at all, regardless of what the problem itself looks like? Now that sounds abstract, but actually yields 4 different ways of seeing the problem. So type 1 is what we know as either collective action or commons problems. made famous by Eleanor Austin and Garrett Harding, the typical tragedy of the commons, where communities, in the absence of strong authoritative institutions, tend to engage in overharvesting of a renewable resource, be it fish or timber, because individuals know that if they don't participate in overharvesting, their neighbors will. And so they may as well gain some short-term economic benefit, even though the long-term effects are catastrophic on the community as a whole. So Austin works on this problem and says, look, let's look at the actual features of the problem itself. And her first case is fish. Fish happen to swim. And Austin says, the common practice of solving common tragedy, privatization of land, does not work for fish because they swim. And therefore, you need different institutional arenas to solve this collective action problem. And she spent a generation winning Nobel Prize in economics for developing local community-based governance for solving a particular class of common strategies. So she's problem feature focused. She gets at the nitty-gritty of the problem itself, whatever it happens to be, but she's chasing utility. So her overall goal is to promote economic welfare and enhance economic welfare around that reason. That's type 1. Type 2 says, actually, economic welfare matters no matter what. We shouldn't be focused on one problem by itself, but we should be looking at whether or not solving a problem at hand, whatever it happens to be, can find a solution that enhances overall economic welfare. And if we can't find an innovative solution to addressing the problem at hand that enhances overall economic welfare, then the answer is you can't solve that problem because economic welfare matters more than any problem at hand. So, what does this lead to in our world? It leads to Nobel Prize winning Nordhaus arguing that the actual optimal outcome for the climate crisis will lead us to a 3.2 degree world. That's the optimal outcome for human beings, even though we know from the climate scientists that 1.5 is the maximum amount for the ecology of the planet. There's a mismatch between optimization approaches based on utility-enhancing concerns of motivating our policy analysis from the ecological problems we're facing. And so you can only whack the type 4 role of the optimization approach if you find synergy. And if you don't, too bad, optimization matters more. So in my work, I noticed that actually another tool emerged that also is not focusing on problem structure, but is different than the optimization tool. And that's what we call the compromise tool, following Bernstein, where you try and develop a balanced or deliberative approach among stakeholders and citizens to generate trust and legitimacy to govern effectively. And by bringing people on board, you hope to make a pretty good decision. And of course, this is the stuff of political science, what we actually do. We think about trust, legitimacy, authority, and how to govern to benefit most people and empower the disempowered. It's a very good, moral, reframed, important way to proceed, but it does not get generated based on the problem at hand. It's an example I always refer to as my home country of Canada, in the province of Newfoundland. The scientists told the fishers in Newfoundland they were harvesting too many cod at a higher level than the reproduction rate. And if they continued, they would have a type 1 tragedy common take place. But they invoked a multi-stakeholder compromise approach to adjudicate this problem. And they involved municipalities, First Nations, workers, and they got a really trustable, legitimate response to this problem. And they listened to the scientists, but they didn't actually identify a catch level consistent with the scientists because they were just one stakeholder. And the problem was, as you know, they chose a level that was too high, and the result was catastrophic collapse of the fishery for 25 years. So sometimes this means you've got to develop policies that are based on problem structure, but they're not economic problems, they're actually ecological problems. And so I argue that the prioritization tool, which advances thinking about problem structure first, and then doing a sequential approach to policy analysis, that rejects commensability biases, is where we need to think about our cognitive brains if we want to advance transformation projects that are consistent with the climate crisis. Now, the best example of this tool doesn't come from actually the ecology. It comes from the folks working on anti-slavery norms. All of you know that anti-slavery norms are so strong right now, thank God, that you would never do a stakeholder engagement exercise to assess whether slaves should be allowed to be owned. You would never do cost-benefit analysis out of Nordhaus to figure out whether it was optimal to own slaves or not. Because we grant anti-slavery norms electrical status above a compromise or cost-benefit approach. And then we rank other problems lower than that. In other words, that problem is not up for grabs, even if economic welfare goes down. And yet, we used to think this way when it came to the environment. Our rules would incorporate then limiting human activities on the environment, given we were actually, by being utility enhancing or compromise focused human beings, undermining the environment. We used to do this, and now we don't. We now actually turn to the optimization tool and the compromise tool and the common tool to solve type 4 problems. And that's dramatically limited our ability to actually be innovative and to actually foster that transformation project. But the important point here is that all schools are ethical. They all come very, very deeply ethical foundations. So arguing ethics alone is not enough because that just is going to put people's backs up, and they're all being ethical, but they're not all being fit for purpose. And so what I want to think about is how do we then go back to thinking about type 4? And in the book, I noticed that we're seeing drift away from type 4 since the 1970s within professional environment schools, where I used to work at Yale, and market-driven policy tools, like I mentioned. We also see it with sustainability practitioners, and they're thinking now almost every intervention out there has got a business case attached to it. Even think tanks are on board, and even us as scholars are on board. This drift away from type 4. So this is a preliminary data set. We actually coded the Journal of Regulation and Governance and the Journal of Environmental Innovation and Societal Transitions, ICE, to see where sustainability-focused papers fit on these 4 types. Now, I haven't got time to give you details, but I just want to note that in regulation and governance, of all the papers on sustainability, only 11.8 was classified as type 4 kinds of papers. And in ICE, it was 17.8. So that's curious, because I would have thought it would be much higher given the community we're involved in and we're trying to think about. So that's a whole new paper in itself. I just give this to you as a flavor of how we're all drifting away from type 4. So given all that, then I want to turn now, how do we then manage the type 4 problems? If I'm right and we're seeing drift, and this is the problem, how do we then return to managing the type 4 problems? And of course, that means the first task, given the type 4 approach, is to really target on-the-ground features of the problem at hand. So I'm going to go to what I first did with Levin, Alden, Bernstein, where we looked at type 4 problems as super wicked problems. We identified there, with careful reflection, 4 critical features of this class of problems that the climate crisis presented. I'm going to go kind of fast now because this is just a just point to get to my last point I want to make before we get to Q&A. But the main take-home here is we identified 4 key features of these problems. 1, time is running out, just like my talk is right now, which distinguishes a lot of political problems that you can go back time and time again to the policy process and revisit, whether it be, for example, access to abortion rights, gun control, and so on. At some point, the super wicked problem, type 4, that is, it's too late to act. The carbon dioxide sits in the atmosphere for 300 years. That's a scientific fact we can't change, and it means that we have too much carbon. At some point, we're locked into this tipping point that's catastrophic, like in Newfoundland, but at a grander scale. Second, those seeking to end the problem are also causing the problem, so we're having a battle with ourselves which is similar to the way a smoker might want to try and pay somebody to hide their cigarettes so you can actually tend to your long-term interests. Third, policies discount the future rationally. The policies in place are not consistent with the science that we're looking at and what a rational response might be. And then finally, no central authority. So when these features exist, and we think they make sense for the climate crisis, then you must design policies that reflect these three features. So in the case of superlative problems, this means finding some kind of policy lock-in in place so we can actually tend to our future selves and not keep avoiding our future interests. And as you all know, a generation of political scientists and governance scholars are working on lock-in to think about climate-related challenges, where you do something now, create a critical juncture, and you lock in a path-dependent process that might lead to a transformative outcome versus avoiding it. So you all know this kind of stuff. It makes sense. It's based on the key features of the problem at hand. It's meant to act accordingly. I'm going to skip this slide because of my time, but I'm just arguing in this slide that the best policy designs out there are the ones that incorporate into their actual mechanisms of calibration a long-term pathway process that can lead to significant norm change. And so the case of Germany's feed-in tariff programs on solar panels changed the way consumers thought about how to behave in a low-carbon way. It changed their demand for solar panels. It created more demand for low-carbon technologies. And then this policy became so diffuse around the world owing to norm change that it's lowered the price of global solar panels. So designing for path dependency by incorporating a calibration around really smart ways can do really cool things. We know it actually works. But the problem with pathways analysis is that it's difficult to adapt to new knowledge. And the criticism has been you could buy technologies that become dated and actually are not low carbon technologies anymore. And they may fail to achieve their targets. And even if you had a bunch of successful path-dependent processes, you would have no way of knowing whether you were going to get to the 1.5 degree objective or not. It's too abstract at the broad level. And so Levin, Ald, and Berkeley and myself, we have thought about this, and we've added this point that whatever you do must be designed with the 1.5 degree objective at hand. But how do you know exactly? And if you didn't know, how did you design accordingly? So I'm going to just briefly review the second puzzle that I think, the second empirical puzzle that I think handles and offers a clue to how we would design for type 4 superlative problems to achieve a 1.5 degree future instead of overshooting. So here's the second puzzle. Despite puzzle number 1, some type 4 problems are being well managed. So just again, briefly, ozone layer globally is often seen as one of the successful cases of global environmental governance, where the ozone is actually healing after years of degradation. And the answer is because of the reduction in those gases causing the ozone layer to become opened up. Acid rain, same thing. In North America and the Great Lakes, acid rain was filling Great Lakes regions. And over time, the soils and water are now recovering from acid rain. Why? Massive reductions in sulfur dioxide causing the acid rain. Type 4 species threatened with extinction in the United States, this cute little owl. And by the way, I think we should say for sure that of all the type 4 problems out there, cute little owl should be at the top of our list, right? Because it's so adorable. This cute little owl was my first research project as a doctoral student, and it was threatened with extinction from too much logging in old growth forests. What happened? Massive reductions in logging in old growth forests. Flash forward to pandemic. If you look at those countries where they had very low lives lost, Australia, South Korea, Singapore, New Zealand, all of them had type 4 response, not not in the ones that were worse didn't have type A. They granted lexical status to problems, looked at the key features, and acted accordingly. How so? What explains the success then of these cases? And I would argue it's because they all identified very durable and very concrete policy objectives. They weren't abstract, they're measurable, and they were clear. And they had massive changes in policy tools, settings, and calibrations in response to new scientific knowledge about the problem at hand. So epidemiology was behind the spread of COVID-19, as new knowledge emerged. The type 4 successful cases constantly adapted their settings, their calibrations in response to new epidemiology. In the ozone, chlorine chemicals damaging the ozone was seen as being scientifically causing the problem. They were reduced. Sulfur, including water and soil, same thing, massive reductions based on the science. Boggy and ozone forests also then were reduced. So what do they have all in common? Why do all these processes respond to the science when in the climate crisis and so much other biodiversity, they're not responding to the science about these problems? Because they're Newfoundland. Why do we have so many Newfoundlands? But why do we have some cases where actually we have type 4 policy approaches? And I would argue it's because they're all denoted by very clear, mandatory, target-based regulatory requirements. They're not abstract, soft goals. Very clear, target-based requirements. Finance and market-driven innovations were present, but they were used to improve, not just away from type 4 problems. They were used as a mechanism to reinforce the type 4 problems, not just away from them. Just for example, Great Lakes Acid Rain Program had a cap and trade system in place where factories could trade each other's binding mandatory targets in order to achieve compliance of the regulations that were consistent with what the scientists said was required to maintain the ecology of the lake, but they could do so in a way that was cost effective because some companies could actually produce more than their quota at a cheaper rate than their competitors. And this allowed for a very efficient way of achieving type 4, which is not avoiding them. But today, cap and trade has become part of the type 2 world, minimizing, limiting type 4. So why doesn't this drift occur? Why doesn't we get drift away from type 4 problems given all this drift to type 3 communities? And I'm going to argue my 2 remaining minutes that they were all governed by thermostatic mechanisms. Every successful case I just showed you there had a thermostatic mechanism in place. It's quite extraordinary. So what are these thermostats, Dan? And this is the last part of my book that I'm really trying to teach students to research on, to prepare for more research around. They are systems of policy interactions in which some kind of changes in outside perturbation triggers changes in some kinds of policies in order to maintain stability of policy goals and objectives. This is what Michael Hallett and I wrote in our article in GPS about 15 years ago. It's just the way a thermostat responds to changes in outside temperatures by turning on or off a furnace to maintain a house's internal temperature. The exact same kind of mechanism, very durable, 21 degrees Celsius internally, massive changes outside, and massive changes in tools and calibrations to maintain the objectives. This means unpacking much more and not conflating in one policy regime as being either stable and durable or all changing, but instead to unpack what's changing and what's durable. They all had built-in triggering mechanisms. The house is a compound bar, but all have some kind of tripwire in some way or not that caused it to happen without going back to some kind of legislative process. Some kind of tripwire was present in all these cases. So the most obvious case you know about is that of central banks. Most central banks all around the world have an inflation target of around 2% per year. And if they mess up, if inflation goes high, they change massively. Monetary policy, buying bonds, selling bonds, interest rates, to get back to that very clear objective. And governments give them the authority to do so because they know that they actually manage for us in the long run. The type 2 thermostats do exist, and they're created on purpose and by design. But they also existed in the type 4 problems I just showed you. So just briefly, the US tripwire says that if a species, if scientists tell us a species is being threatened or endangered, that government agencies must be appointed to bring back that species to what's known as viability, and that no amount of economic analysis can change this requirement. It's based solely on the ecological evidence required to bring back this species to viability. And it's reinforced by the ability of NGOs to sue governments for non-compliance. This tripwire explains why that cute little owl was saved, when normally the timber industry has so much sway, you'd lose owls and you gain other benefits, such as communities who are forest dependent. The type 1 communities were hurt by this approach. Okay, whacking the type 4 mole here, let's say the owl, created forest dependent community loss. You can't avoid this mole problem, but you can decide beforehand what mole is most important for the policy at hand. So then, what does this all mean then for going forward? With Levinol and various things, I argue there are 2 lock-in taps for creating these things in the future. One is authority, how to maintain the thermostat's ability to govern in some way, which does require speaking of legitimacy, authority, and trust in some way. And the dominant methods are qualitative and conceptual. How do we think about maintaining long-term authority so they can withstand pressures of risk? But 2, they must also have lock-in durable policy objectives, very clear, measurable targets that requires incorporating the science of the problem at hand, very technocratic, engineering, science-based approaches, often involving quantitative and technical knowledge. And both sources of knowledge are needed to build these thermostats. But the design dilemma is that taking one in isolation from the other can actually undermine the other task at hand. So, for example, constant rule changes in response to COVID-19 might be good for the science, but it might lose the legitimacy and authority needed to govern. So how do you manage these interactions is a question that I want to do more work on in the future. So then, to conclude, what are some lessons right now for designing the type 4 thermostat? I would argue first, on the climate crisis. Financing for sure is necessary, but it's insufficient. If you're not careful, you're just going to get to a drift of type 2 problems. And already Carney is seeing this with trying to deal and implement his $130 trillion commitments. They're not going as well as he expected, like the World Bank experienced in 2007. The moles are being created here. 2, you got to decide which moles are to be whacked first. Where's your anti-slavery norm comparison? You've got to rank problems. You can't do commensability bias approaches. So this means that biodiversity and climate management must be conceptualized measures as type 4 problems. This means that stakeholder policy design deliberations can still be important, but not for type 3 problems, but how to design to integrate technical and conceptual knowledge that is so often so far apart in order to achieve compliance with type 4 problems in ways that don't lead to policy drift. And this means, number 4, we have to begin and end whatever we do, whatever arguments we make, whatever conclusions we find, we must begin and end with problem conception assessment to decide and justify our analysis and prescriptions, including what moles to rack and what moles may just be accepted. I'm going to leave it there for now and just go to our last visual. The roller coaster has now ended. I look forward to hearing any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Ben. And time for questions and answer, comments. Who wants to go first? I see Carlos and then Sebastian. So Carlos, please.
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask you about in the definition of super wicked problems, you have the assumption that they lack a central authority, and I wanted to ask you to elaborate on the extent to which this lack of a central authority is necessarily a bad thing that exacerbates a problem. What are the implications of this lack of central authority? Because I was thinking about the literature on crisis management and the extent to which hierarchies are necessarily synonymous of effective or ineffective crisis management, or whether decentralized management is an utopia or not. So that was my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I love the question. I actually handle in this chapter 7, where I'm reviewing super wicked problems and then thermostats. And the chapter got out of hand. It's like 80 pages now, answering your question in detail. And what I'm arguing is actually not all super wicked problems have that last feature. Some do, some don't. The actual question is, what's the problem feature at hand? So you can either, like in the case of the owl, there was central authority. And so it made the policy response in the thermostat design different than if there hadn't been central authority. So this should be an open question for that last one. It shouldn't be taken as given. Otherwise, you undermine problem-solving capacity based on an inductive approach. But likewise, if you don't have central authority, it doesn't mean it's all terrible, right? The German government's feed and care program has been picked up by 160 jurisdictions all over the world, despite no convention requiring it to be the case. So the norm is diffusion pathway. British Columbia in Canada doubled its protected areas 25 years ago, owing to Brundtland-esque norms that the world ought to have 12% land in protection. So you can do things without central authority that are useful, but you don't want to undermine those cases where they actually are. So, and then there's more points about Ostrom arguing that the lower you get, the more authority you get. And she liked local governance, but then I argue that her polycentric metaphor brought it back, but in a very utility-oriented way that I think undermines the climate crisis rather than solves it. But yeah, great questions. And I think the bottom line is focus on problem structure, whatever it is, and then make the case accordingly for why the intervention might work.
Thank you, Ben. And Sebastian, and afterwards, Eran. Please, Sebastian.
Thank you very much. I was actually just clapping, but
Okay.
I also have a question, if that's fine.
Sure.
Thank you, Ben. I always enjoy your talks, and I was just wondering, and we have these discussions, I guess, regularly, what the empirical implications is. So I was actually now intrigued about thinking how the actual empirical analysis of policy mixes kind of should change, right? Because of the problems that you identified. And one thing that I think is that if you're right, then we should focus much more on the problem understanding that is behind whatever policy is decided upon, right? And that would kind of be contrary to what we normally do, at least what I do in my empirical work. We sort of accept, okay, this is about climate change or biodiversity protection or whatever, and then move on to the real stuff.
Yeah.
In a way, right?
Yeah.
So I would just like to know whether you agree with this assessment that we should actually focus much more on the seemingly very abstract stuff rather than the more practical side of things.
You know, it's funny, as you know, I don't see the distinction because anything we do as scholars, we either take a topic because we find it interesting and then we go research on it. But if we want to speak about the problem itself, we have to think about the actual nature of the problem. You can't get around it. A lot of our community uses the environment as a topic, but it doesn't really do the comma, this means therefore that, right? So it's not really helpful for the world, it's more helpful for our journals. But most of us care about the actual world. So I think it's not a problem to say how we interrogate and bring our particular value added into what's a much broader source of knowledge that's required to think about these problems. And therefore the inductive part of the problem structure matters. what is the logical features at hand. It's me once you do that, you can then categorize and extrapolate and generalize across the same features in different problems, as long as you don't go beyond those features in extrapolating the design level. That's one answer I think is useful. But the other one I think is, if thermostats matter, then how do they actually work? So the next task then is, and this is going to be the next 3 to 5 years work, and I really very much appreciate this community right now on this webinar, because you think this way. But basically, you see 3 tasks. So one is first to identify empirically cases of thermostats out there already. It isn't just central banks; they're all over the place, but they're also random. So how do you identify them and document all the cases out there of thermostats? That's the first empirical question. And the second question is, how many of those are type 4 thermostats? So can you generalize central bank design to a type 4? I don't know. Maybe a little bit, maybe not completely, right? So what are the types? And once you have that database of empirics, then you can begin to actually explain their emergence. What explains why they emerged? Was it a policy design feature? Was it a cultural explanation? Whatever it was, what explains their emergence? And in most cases, I think design actually can help explain a lot, I think. Once you do that, and you can actually generate a robust set of expectations, like Austin did for their own type of action challenges, you can then probably identify design lessons for creating new thermostats, which I think the climate needs. It needs not just path dependency. Path dependency went too far. Because it meant anything to be locked in. And really, it should be locked in objectives only. So how do we extrapolate lessons for that? To me, it becomes really exciting stuff. I'm now working the conclusion on one idea that I have for how you would do that for the climate crisis. To me, that's the sort of the way forward. Going from descriptive to explanatory to apply.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Now, Iran, and then Nirvia from Brazil. Iran and Ben, please do it concise, so because we have the limits of time. So please, Iran.
Thank you, Ben. It was fascinating. Looking at it from the sustainability literature perspective, there's a shift today away from the SDGs towards red lines, or what I call the double negatives. I mean, if you look, whether it's planetary boundaries, whether it's safe and just spaces, railroads type of work, which actually ties in with your triggering mechanisms, because trade-offs are inevitable. I mean, sustainability is multidimensional. Climate is just one dimension out of many.
Yeah.
And so the trade-offs are inevitable. The question is, are the trade-offs important or not? Because if you're within the safe and just space, okay, so there's trade-offs, which is a function of politics and power at a local place. The question is, when do you cross the red lines? And they are construed. So really the main policy issue, I think, is how do you construe red lines? Who construes them? How do you build the red lines? How do you define them? What you call triggering mechanisms. So that is, I think, where the main issue is when you talk about these kind of issues. And they are highly contextualized, because it is something that's also multi-level. I mean, it's not only a question of the global level, but it's multi-level, and they would be construed differently, because the issues which are pertained, when you look at it at a local or national or regional level, would be different.
Yeah.
And then the question is, how do you relate these kind of triggering mechanism or red lines across scales and across space? So that's kind of the questions I had.
Okay, 2 quick thoughts given the time. First, I'm not so much into the things like for example, degrowth, or these sort of planetary boundaries metaphors that sound good, but they're very abstract. And it's hard to know what to do with them exactly. The objective approach to thermostats, it's a very precise thing that has to be maintained. To me, it gives you much more analytical traction than going into abstract debates about, broader questions that may just straighten out of the fuel and not lead to effects in the ground. That's a longer conversation. But on the red lines, I would say we've decided as a red line, 1.5. But, I mean, governments have agreed to this, but nothing they're doing is actually consistent with that. So to me, we would need some kind of national thermostatic system in addition to a local thermostat that would override any intervention happening at some kind of bottom-up level. And we're working now in the conclusion of the book on one idea for creating national thermostats. It draws on some of my collaborative work using people in this audience. That might be a way of getting at that issue. I wish I had more time to give you a response to your question. I think it's really great, and I wouldn't mind further conversation with you on these issues. But I still think the more we get more concrete and clear and less abstract, the more we can actually then build more of these things.
Thank you. Thank you. And Nilvia Urbana from Brazil, please.
Sorry, my camera is not working. I'm from Brazil. I'm from the Center of Advanced Amazonian Students, NAIA. The name in the is located in Amazonia, of course. And my question is related. Well, I don't have any effectiveness process of environmental regulation in Latin America. So in Amazonia, under Bolsonaro government, you know by the news and the newspapers, okay? But what I am curious, because curiously, I think that the difference between protocols and regimes in governance and transnational governance are not trivial question. And I would like to understand in your framework and about your types of proposal, what this question, because the question of how these protocols and regimes are built in the global arena have some difference how they operate in local level. It's local dilemma, no? And I would like to understand this question of effectiveness because, well, the new name now is bioeconomy. So how bioeconomy will save the world? No. So I would like to understand if you have something about South America and Amazon.
Thank you very much,
Okay, thank you.
We will go for that. Yeah.
Okay.
Let me respond quickly to, of course, a very important question. This is the constant question. Well, that's the north, something's different. But I would say two things. One, by the way, it's not bioeconomy now, it's now nature-based solutions. Every year a new metaphor emerges. It gets very confusing and tiring. But what I would say is this framework is meant to say whatever you do, design it in a way consistent with the key features of the problem. And if you've got a lack of authority in some kind of local region, as Austin found in her work, you must design accordingly. But it doesn't mean you can't do type 4 problem solving. So one quick example, in Cambodia, one of my students is working on conservation of the giant ibis, just like an owl. The giant ibis needs this protected area, and the area is protected. But of course, in the developing world, the problem is people come in and they harvest and they damage the protected area. So the government developed a ring road around the protection that's going right. And that right is providing economic benefits to the community and also stopping incursion in the protected area. And they're now selling the rights as being eco-certified to the giant ibis. So it's a finance mechanism to reinforce a type 4 conservation approach that takes into account developing world challenges of very much local people need to have access to a livelihood. So to me, you design that way, and you design that way to create the thermostat to make sense. So I embrace your point. Doesn't mean though you can't do type 4 problem solving. You absolutely can do type 4.
Thank you very much, Ben. This fascinating presentation on governance issue, 4 types of problems, 4 types of moles. and the one thermostat that we will hear about it a lot in the future. I think if I got it right, this is on the agenda for your future research. There are papers to read, and I believe that if you approach Benjamin or Ben, write in an email, you can start and read it. Ben, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to host you here. Hopefully it will not be the last time. And you are invited again to Jerusalem and to our series. Thank you all for being with us today. And I'd like to remind you that we have another presentation on university governance this evening, 7 o'clock Israel time, 7 o'clock Israel time, 6 o'clock European time. I'm not sure Amazon time or Brazilian times and so on, but 7 and 6, and looking forward to have you with us. Thank you very much all. Thank you.